I never thought I'd end up following in my old man's footsteps, but life has a funny way of steering you down unexpected paths. My father was a logger in Upper Tennessee for 3 decades, a man as sturdy and unyielding as the trees he felled. He'd wake before dawn, his calloused hands wrapped around a thermos of black coffee, and head out into the misty mountains that had been our family's livelihood for generations. I can still picture him standing tall among the pines, his flannel shirt damp with sweat, and his eyes squinting against the sunlight filtering through the canopy. Even when his joints ached and his lungs wheezed from years of breathing in sawdust, he'd be out there, chainsaw in hand, doing what he loved. "There's honor in this work," he'd tell me, his voice gruff but filled with pride. "We're not just cutting trees, we're building America, one log at a time." As a young man, I'd help out during summers and holidays, learning the trade bit by bit. But I had dreams of my own, thinking I'd escape the hard life of a logger. I took a job at the local sawmill, figuring it was a step up from tramping through the woods all day. It was steady work, and I could go home each night without worrying about bears or twisted ankles miles from civilization. Still, I'd find myself helping Pop with contracts on weekends, the smell of fresh-cut pine and the rumble of heavy machinery calling to something deep inside me. It wasn't until Pop got sick that I realized how much the logging life had seeped into my bones. Even as his body betrayed him, he'd insist on going out to the job sites, supervising the crew and making sure everything was done right. I'd watch him hobble around, barking orders and checking equipment, his face etched with determination. It was like the forest itself was keeping him alive, giving him purpose when his own flesh was failing him. When he passed, it hit me harder than I expected. The sawmill felt empty, meaningless. I'd stand at my station, watching boards slide by, and all I could think about was the living, breathing forest where those planks had come from. My marriage had been on the rocks for years, more habit than love keeping us together. With Pop gone, that last tether snapped, and I found myself divorced and adrift, searching for something to anchor me. That's when I made the decision to take over Pop's business. It wasn't just about carrying on his legacy. It was about finding my own place in the world. I called up my brother, who'd been working odd jobs since high school, and asked if he wanted in. "Hell yes," he said without hesitation. "Been waiting for you to come to your senses." My nephews, strapping young men with sawdust in their veins, joined up too. Just like that, we were a family operation again. The logging industry ain't what it used to be, though. Regulations, competition from overseas, and changing markets have made it tougher than ever to scratch out a living from the land. We're constantly pushing deeper into the mountains, seeking stands of timber worth harvesting. Some days, we're working in areas so thick you can't walk 5 feet without bumping into a tree. It's dangerous, back-breaking work, but there's a satisfaction in it that I never found at the sawmill. One of the biggest challenges is the remoteness of our job sites. We're often miles from the nearest road, accessible only by rugged logging trails that we have to cut ourselves. There's a government gate at the bottom of the mountain, marking the boundary between civilization and wilderness. Once you pass through that gate, you're in another world, one where cell phones are useless, and the only sounds are the whine of chainsaws and the crash of falling timber. To protect our equipment from theft and vandalism, we started leaving someone on site overnight. We've got this small pull-up camper, barely big enough for a couple of bunks, and a tiny kitchenette. It ain't much, but it beats sleeping on the ground. I remember the first time I volunteered for an overnight shift. As I watched my crew drive away, leaving me alone in the gathering dusk, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The forest seemed to close in around me, alive with shadows and whispers. Little did I know that night would be the start of something that would change my life forever. Something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. It was a day like any other when everything changed. We'd been working a tough site near Devil's Looking Glass, deep in the heart of Upper Tennessee's national forest. The summer heat was oppressive, turning the air thick and heavy, making even the simplest tasks feel like wading through molasses. We'd been at it since dawn. The constant growl of chainsaws and the thunderous crash of falling trees our only companions. Hank, one of our most experienced guys, was working the cables, securing logs for transport when it happened. I heard his shout over the din of machinery, saw him stumble back, clutching his hand. Blood was already seeping through his fingers, staining his work gloves a deep crimson. The cable had slipped, slicing clean through his palm. It was bad enough that I knew right away he'd need stitches. "All right, boys, pack it up," I hollered, already moving towards Hank. "We're calling it a day early." My brother nodded, understanding without words that he'd need to drive Hank to the hospital. It was a good hour's drive to the nearest emergency room, winding down treacherous mountain roads. As they loaded up, I made a split-second decision. "I'll stay behind," I said. "Someone's got to watch the equipment." Usually we draw straws for overnight duty, but with Hank out of commission and the others needed to keep production going, it made sense for me to volunteer. Besides, a part of me welcomed the solitude. It had been a while since I'd spent a night alone in the woods, just me and the trees and the stars overhead. As the trucks rumbled away, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the stifling air, I set about securing the site. Our current job was about as remote as they come, tucked away in a little hollow with no trails leading to it. The only way in or out was the logging road we cut ourselves, barely wide enough for our trucks to squeeze through. At the bottom of the mountain, a sturdy government gate stood sentinel, marking the boundary between our world and the wilds beyond. I made my way to the small pull-up camper we kept on site for these overnight stays. It wasn't much to look at, just a tin can on wheels, really, but it beat sleeping on the ground. Inside, there were a couple of narrow bunks, a tiny kitchenette, and not much else. But it was shelter, and after a long day of work, it looked like the Ritz-Carlton to my tired eyes. As the sun began to dip behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I settled into a folding chair outside the camper. The forest seemed to come alive as darkness fell, a symphony of crickets and tree frogs rising up from the underbrush. I cracked open a lukewarm beer, letting the familiar sounds wash over me. That's when I first noticed it, a feeling more than anything tangible. It was like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, a prickling sensation that made me sit up straighter. I scanned the tree line, squinting into the gathering gloom, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just shadows and more shadows, the forest closing in around our little clearing. Then the smell hit me. At first, I thought it might be something rotting nearby. A dead animal, maybe, or a pile of vegetation turning to compost in the damp heat. But this was different. It was musty and rank, like wet fur mixed with something metallic. It made my nose wrinkle and my stomach turn. I stood up, beer forgotten, and turned in a slow circle. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if 1,000 eyes were fixed on me from the darkness. A twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast silence of the forest. "Anyone there?" No answer came, just the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. I shook my head, trying to laugh off my unease. "Getting jumpy in your old age," I muttered to myself. But as I retreated to the relative safety of the camper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching, waiting. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a night that would haunt me for years to come. A night that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. I tried to shake off the unease as I settled into the cramped confines of the camper. The thin metal walls suddenly felt like flimsy protection against the vast, dark forest outside. I flicked on the small battery-powered lantern, its weak light barely pushing back the shadows that seemed to press in from every corner. Sleep was out of the question, my nerves too jangled by that strange feeling of being watched. Hours crawled by. I leafed through an old magazine, the words blurring before my eyes. The night sounds of the forest, usually a soothing backdrop, now seemed amplified and menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, had me on edge. I kept telling myself it was just the usual nocturnal critters, maybe a curious raccoon or a deer passing through. But deep down, I knew this was different. It started with a gentle rocking. At first, I thought it might be the wind, a strong gust buffeting the small camper. But the movement grew more insistent, more deliberate. The entire structure shuddered, as if something large was leaning against it, testing its strength. My heart leaped into my throat as I heard a low, rumbling growl just outside the thin wall. "Hey," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out of here." I banged on the wall of the camper, hoping to scare off whatever animal was out there. For a moment, everything went still. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, without warning, the camper rocked violently, nearly tipping over. I was thrown from my seat, crashing into the tiny kitchenette. Panic seized me. This was no curious bear or mountain lion. The strength behind that assault was beyond anything I'd encountered in my years in these woods. As I scrambled to my feet, my mind raced through possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. I needed to see what was out there, to confront this thing that had turned my quiet night into a waking nightmare. With trembling hands, I grabbed the lantern and my old hunting knife, a pitiful defense against whatever was lurking in the darkness. But it was all I had. Slowly, I cracked open the camper door, the hinges creaking ominously in the stillness. The beam of my lantern cut through the night, revealing nothing but empty space where I expected to see some monstrous shape. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was thick with that rank, musky odor I'd noticed earlier, now so strong it made my eyes water. Swinging the lantern in a wide arc, I scanned the clearing. Our equipment stood silent and undisturbed, excavators and trucks casting long, twisted shadows. The tree line loomed beyond, a wall of impenetrable blackness. That's when I saw it, just for a second, as I swept the light towards my truck. Two eyes, reflecting the lantern's glow, floating at a height that made my blood run cold. No bear reared up on its hind legs could reach that tall. The eyes blinked, and in that instant, I caught a glimpse of a face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was almost human, but wrong. The proportions distorted, the features twisted into something feral and hungry. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a rock. As I fell, the lantern flew from my grasp, shattering against the side of the camper. Darkness engulfed me. In the distance, I heard the sound of movement, heavy footfalls, and the crack of breaking branches. It was circling the clearing, staying just out of sight. Blind panic took over. I scrambled to my feet and lunged for the truck, fumbling with the keys I'd thankfully left in my pocket. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the gloom. In the rearview mirror, I caught another glimpse of those eyes, closer now, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. I threw the truck into gear and gunned it, tires spinning in the loose gravel before finding purchase. The logging road stretched before me, a narrow path through the pressing darkness of the forest. I took the curves too fast, the truck fishtailing dangerously, but fear pushed me on. In the mirrors, I could see nothing but darkness, but the feeling of pursuit was overwhelming. Halfway down the mountain, it hit. The truck rocked violently as something massive slammed into the rear. The back window exploded in a shower of glass. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it that foul, musky stench. I heard the screech of claws on metal, felt the truck shudder as an immense weight landed in the bed. I didn't dare look back. My world narrowed to the patch of road illuminated by the headlights, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The truck groaned under the strain, the engine protesting as I pushed it to its limits. Another impact rocked the vehicle, and I felt claws rake across the roof, the sound of tearing metal cutting through the roar of the engine. The government gate at the bottom of the mountain loomed ahead, a barrier between me and safety. I fumbled for the remote, praying it would work at this distance. The gate began to slide open, agonizingly slow. I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. The truck smashed through, taking the gate off its track in a screech of tortured metal. As I burst out onto the main road, the presence behind me seemed to recede. The oppressive weight lifted, the feeling of pursuit fading. I drove for miles, my heart pounding before I dared to slow down. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. In the harsh glare of the overhead light, I examined myself for injuries. That's when I saw it, a set of deep scratches on my hand, already swelling and turning an angry red. I didn't remember being struck, but there was no denying the evidence. As I stared at the wounds, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Whatever had attacked me, whatever impossible creature I'd encountered in those dark woods, had left its mark. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when my brother and nephews found me. I was still sitting in my battered truck on the side of the road, staring blankly at my wounded hand. Their voices seemed to come from far away, muffled and distorted as if I was underwater. It wasn't until my brother shook me roughly that I snapped back to reality. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" he demanded, his eyes wide as he took in the state of the truck. The back window was gone, shards of glass littering the bed. Deep gouges ran along the sides and roof, the metal peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? In that moment, a decision was made that would haunt me for years to come. Bear attack, I heard myself say, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Big one, came out of nowhere. The relief on their faces was palpable. A bear attack was unusual, sure, but it was something they could understand, something that fit into their view of the world. As we drove back to the logging site to assess the damage and retrieve the abandoned equipment, I found myself expanding on the lie. I spun a tale of a hungry black bear, desperate and aggressive. I described how I'd managed to fend it off and escape, embellishing the story with details I knew would make it more believable. With each word, I felt a piece of myself slipping away, buried under the weight of this fabrication. The next few weeks passed in a blur. There were reports to file, insurance claims to process. The local game warden came out to investigate, nodding solemnly as I recounted my fictional encounter. I threw myself into work, pushing myself and my crew harder than ever. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to avoid dwelling on that night and the true nature of what I'd seen. But in the quiet moments, when the chainsaws fell silent and the day's work was done, the memories would come flooding back. The inhuman eyes glowing in the darkness, the impossible strength that had nearly overturned the camper, the fetid stench that seemed to cling to my nostrils even now. And always, there was the wound on my hand, a constant reminder that what I'd experienced was all too real. The scratches healed slowly, leaving behind a set of raised, silvery scars. But even as the physical evidence faded, I found myself changing in subtle ways. My senses seemed sharper, especially at night. I could pick out individual scents on the wind, distinguish the calls of birds I'd never noticed before. My strength and stamina increased, allowing me to work longer hours without tiring. At first, I attributed these changes to heightened awareness after my brush with death. But as the months wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within me. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid dreams of running through moonlit forests on all fours. My body twisted and changed into something not quite human. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the taste of raw meat in my mouth. During the day, I found myself growing increasingly irritable, snapping at my crew over minor mistakes. The approach of the full moon filled me with a nameless dread, a restless energy that set my teeth on edge. It was nearly 2 years after that fateful night when I could no longer deny the truth. I stood before the bathroom mirror, examining my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. My eyes, once an unremarkable brown, now held a hint of amber, seeming to glow faintly in the right light. My canine teeth had grown sharper, more pronounced, and there, sprouting from my forearms and the back of my hands, were coarse, dark hairs that no amount of shaving seemed to eliminate. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just traumatized by my encounter in the woods. I was changing, transforming into something akin to the creature that had attacked me, the bite or scratch. I still wasn't sure which had infected me with something beyond the understanding of modern medicine. I was becoming a monster. In that moment, staring at my slowly altering reflection, I knew I couldn't keep this secret any longer. The lies I'd told, the story I'd fabricated, it all came crashing down around me. I had to tell someone, had to seek help before the change progressed any further. But who would believe me? Who could I trust with a truth so fantastic, so terrifying? And so, I find myself here, pouring out my story in the hopes that someone, somewhere will understand. I don't know how much time I have left before the transformation is complete, before the last vestiges of my humanity slip away. All I know is that the forest holds secrets darker and more terrible than I ever imagined, and I am living proof of the horrors that lurk in the shadows of those ancient trees. As I write these words, I can feel the change coming on stronger than ever before. My bones ache, my skin feels too tight. The call of the wild pulses in my veins, urging me to abandon civilization and return to the deep woods where this all began. I don't know if I'll be able to resist much longer. So I leave this account as a warning, a plea, and a confession. Beware the darkness that lies beyond the tree line, for there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that can change you in ways you never thought possible. And if you see a logger with amber eyes and two sharp teeth, know that once, not so long ago, he was just a man like any other, before the forest claimed him for its own.